Good evening. My name is Michael Lewis, and I am with the Hilton Head MLK Committee for Justice, and I have the pleasure to introduce to you this evening Dr. Patricia Felton Montgomery. She's president of the League of Women Voters for Hilton Head and Bluffton and director of Racial Justice for the South Carolina League of Women Voters. Ms. Montgomery, can you please tell us about your work and why you are so passionate about voting?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. In my two roles locally for the League and at the state level, I see these two roles as closely intertwined. For there can be no racial justice without voting justice, and there can be no voting justice without racial justice. The League of Women Voters has as its mission empowering voters, defending democracy. And so I am proud to be involved in an organization that on February 14th will be 101 years old. An organization that is nonpartisan, that is activist, that is a grassroots organization that believes that voters should play a critical role in democracy. So how do we help voters to play such a critical role? First, we see voting as a sacred right, just like the right of liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. Without the right to vote, these other three rights are not fully achievable. Therefore, we fight to protect the rights of all eligible voters and to expand access to those who've been left out of our democratic process. We spearhead efforts to enact common sense voter reforms in South Carolina and in our county, such as absentee voting, without having to give one of 19 reasons why a citizen cannot vote in person. And we protect millions of voters every year through aggressive advocacy and education efforts. And the League has been at the forefront, particularly this last election season, of major voting rights court cases over the last decade. For example, most recently, here in South Carolina for the November elections, the League brought lawsuits to stop so-called curing of voter signatures before citizens could vote. We fought against last-minute calls for witness signatures on election ballots in November, and we won expanded days and hours at voting precincts so that everyone could vote at a time and day more convenient for them. Secondly, we hold education forums for citizens so that they can learn about the positions of candidates for office at local and state levels. In fact, our local League of Women Voters of Hilton Head Island and the Bluffton area held 5 forums for candidates running for the U.S. Senate, for the House of Representatives, for local offices such as the Hilton Head Town Council, and we let the public pose questions to these candidates about critical issues important to them, so that they would be able to know their positions on such things as affordable housing, the environment, and the candidates' views on the plans for the Route 278 expansion and the effect of this expansion on Gullah communities. Finally, our Vote 411 change.org platform, post political leaders' written responses to similar questions posed to them by our league. This past election season, we sent nearly 6,000 African American registered voters who had not voted since 2008 postcards reminding them of the importance of their vote. And we worked with the Low Country Immigration Coalition for them to do the same. We distributed 2,000 door hangers on homes and in apartments in the area, and voter information in over 50 businesses and public access locations.
Ms. Montgomery, what do you say to people who feel that their vote won't make a difference?
Well, that's a very, very important question, Michael, because we have seen in the lead up to the November elections and in the recent elections in Georgia that voter turnout and voting make a difference. African American women and men are particularly given credit for the results of voting in these elections. Let me share with you that in Beaufort County in 2020, Biden received 44.38% of the vote as compared to Trump's 54.37%. But while South Carolina is still at the state and local levels a majority red state, with 62% of voters being Republican and only 37.55% being Democrats, you can see from these statistics alone that the difference can be made by registering to vote and voting. President-elect, 44.38%, but in our state, Democrats are only 37.5%. So getting everyone to vote is important.
Tell me, what do you feel prompted the high voter turnout during the presidential election?
I think that voters everywhere, and certainly in our county, have grown to understand the importance of their vote. I think that citizens know that we could all lose our rights if we don't vote. And it really doesn't make any difference what party you may belong to. But we have seen many efforts at voter suppression across this country. As I mentioned earlier, in South Carolina, we don't have drop boxes, for example, to make it easier for people to vote. Also, really, we don't have true early voting. In South Carolina, it's called absentee voting. And until we brought pressure and suits against the South Carolina legislature, citizens in South Carolina had to give one or more of 18 reasons why they couldn't vote in person, even to get an absentee ballot. I think given the COVID, that was seen to be absolutely unreasonable and really heartless, because it put citizens in a position that they had to choose between perhaps contracting a deadly disease or voting. Many times we in the league were asked, where are the drop boxes in Beaufort County? And we had to say there are none. Many times we were asked about why there weren't extended hours, so that we did not have lines of 6 hours, even when it came to the last day of absentee voting for people to vote. In the first 2 weeks, people were really concerned about those long lines, and that made other people come out and vote because they could see that efforts were being made to suppress their vote.
With so much focus on the presidential election, can you talk about local elections and why they are important as well?
Again, a very, very important question, particularly at this particular time. While there was an increase in voter turnout all across the state and the country for the national elections, the number and percent of citizens voting what is called down ballot or for local and state elected positions was not commensurate with the presidential election statistics. For example, 96,613 citizens in Beaufort County voted for either Trump or President-elect Biden, but only 92,167 voted for the U.S. representative candidates Nancy Mace and Joe Cunningham. Now that's a difference of 4,444 votes, which is huge and could make a difference in an outcome of an election. And the results of the state Senate race for District 46, which is most of Beaufort County, was 67,774 votes for Tom Davis, with Nathan Campbell getting 28,839 votes. Now, that difference is even greater. In fact, only about 2/3 of those who voted for president voted in the state Senate race. We simply must understand the importance of voting in state and local elections, even during national elections. Indeed, as our League of Women Voters State Issues and Advocacy Director has pointed out, as a result of people not voting down ballot, the state is even more Republican or more conservative following the 2020 elections because many voters did not vote in the state elections. Now, I want to be clear again that the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, so I am not indicating any preference for Democrats over Republicans. I am just sharing the data so that individual voters can understand the importance of every single vote.
What are your views on the trustworthiness of the election process in light of some of the claims made this year?
By and large, I trust the election process primarily because I trust the director of the boards of registration and elections who fought against all efforts of voter suppression by our legislature, just as the League of Women Voters did. The directors of registration and elections in every county through their state association, and it happens that their vice president of their association is Marie Smalls, our own Beaufort County director. So they requested mail-in voting for both the June primary and November elections, given COVID dangers to voters. They asked for the drop boxes throughout the state and asked for extension of dates and times to count ballots to ensure that every ballot was counted. So if the directors of voter registration and elections ask for these things. This makes me trust the process in our counties. On the other hand, of 98,000 plus votes cast in November in Beaufort County, 436 of those ballots, the second highest in the state, were invalidated in the county because of the confusion over witness signatures that were required after many voters had already sent in their mail-in ballots. Now that 436 number only represents 0.02% of votes, but as we have seen in the recent Georgia elections, and I bring that up because most of us are aware of how close that election was and how a difference of 0.02%, 0.03%, 0.04%, 0.05% was watched closely to see who would eventually win.
What, if anything, would you like to see change in our political system?
Well, I've referred to many of the things that need changing already, but I will repeat them here. That we should have early voting as a legitimate process for voting versus absentee voting with all of its requirements. We should have drop boxes for all elections throughout the state. We shall increase the pay of poll workers so that they can work extended days and hours. And we should have continual training of people to participate in the process by being poll workers and poll managers. We should eliminate witness signatures, as very few states have across the nation. And so these, again, efforts, modern day efforts to suppress voters' rights need to be eliminated. And access needs to be more easily available to voters. We may not have to take voter tests. We may not have to pay a fee to vote, but these items that I have just enumerated are just as effective in keeping people from the polls because they feel that their votes aren't wanted and their votes aren't important.
Ms. Montgomery, in what ways have you been inspired by Dr. King's life and legacy?
Well, I'm going to speak about the inspiration of Dr. King and also that of the Honorable John Lewis, since the theme of this year's program is good trouble. The committee, in presenting preliminary questions to me, reminded me that Martin Luther King said, "There is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Rather," he said, "now is the time to make real the promises of democracy." His statement, made in 1963 in his I Have the Dream speech, is even more true today than it was then. And then the Honorable John Lewis, in an even more activist way, said, "We all," and I'm paraphrasing this next word, "must recognize the fact that if any radical social, political, and economic changes for the good of Americans are to take place in our society, the people, the masses, must bring them about. In the struggle, we must seek more than civil rights. We must work for the community of love, peace, and true brotherhood. Our minds, our souls, and our hearts cannot rest until freedom and justice exist for all people. I also indicated in my biographical statement sent to the committee that I was first inspired during my childhood by my own parents' active participation in civil rights campaigns to change the laws and culture of our nation. My mother, a member of Delta Sigma Theta, as I am, told me about the origins of Delta as being founded on vigorous advocacy for women's rights to vote. And Delta was the only African American sorority or fraternity to march in the 1913 March Down Pennsylvania Avenue for those rights. My father, the National Vice President of Social Action of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity, was the first leader of a fraternal organization, probably for any significant African American organization, to raise money for the Little Rock Nine, when other African American organizations were in fact preaching gradualism. With that heritage of Dr. Martin Luther King, the Honorable John Lewis, and my parents, I have never believed that I could rest until freedom and justice does indeed exist for all people. So I hope that citizens from all over Beaufort County, and certainly in the Bluffton and Hilton Head communities, will also be inspired by these words of these great Americans and will get involved now. There are issues still before us: hate crimes legislation, anti-lynching legislation, and passage of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020, referenced in terms of the U.S. House of Representatives as Bill number 4. That bill passed the U.S. House of Representatives on December 6, 2019, by a decisive margin of 228 to 187 votes. But it was stopped in the Senate by Mitch McConnell. But now we can push for passage as soon as the new Congress convenes. And I want to remind you that in less than a year, the campaign for midterm elections will be upon us. We must get involved to save this nation. Thank you to the Martin Luther King Committee for Justice for this opportunity to speak and to participate in their week-long program to continue the work of Dr. King and the Honorable John Lewis.